All right. I know we haven't given it that much time, but I'm just so excited to start. I'm really excited that so many people are kind of interested in listening to me talk at 9:45 on a Saturday morning. Um, and I'm really passionate about this work. I'm really excited to be kind of presenting it again. This was a thesis project that I did when I attended Carnegie Mellon, which I'll go over in a minute. I'm going to do a little introduction. So this project is called Whose Opportunity, which is analyzing the impacts of the opportunity zone tax policy and imagining alternatives in Pittsburgh. And now I can't change my screen. There we go. Okay, so I'm Ryan. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. I grew up in Brooklyn in New York City, and I came to Pittsburgh to get my master's in urban design from Carnegie Mellon. After graduating in the middle of the pandemic, I started working for the Allegheny County Department of Human Services, and I work in their analytics department doing data storytelling. So you can kind of see kind of where that jump from urban design to data storytelling really comes true in this presentation. So we're going to start by just introducing what the opportunity zone is. An opportunity zone is an economically distressed community where new investments under certain conditions may be eligible for preferential tax treatment. So it's encouraging wealthy investors to invest in specific low income geographies by offering extensive tax breaks. So that's just kind of like a one sentence summary of what the opportunity zone is. And this is kind of what we're going to be going through today. We're going to go through the opportunity zones, what it is, how it works, and then comparing it to historic contexts such as redlining, urban renewal, housing choice vouchers, inclusionary housing, and I'll kind of explain what each of those are. Some of them I'm sure we're more familiar with than other ones. Afterwards, I'm going to kind of give a critique of the opportunity zones and kind of compare it to historic racist housing policy that has had such huge impacts on our country, and of course, how it's relevant specifically to Pittsburgh. And then recommendations on the opportunity zone policy, as well as alternatives. And all throughout that, there's a lot of kind of discussion on housing during the pandemic and how these policies, as well as other kind of capitalist imposed housing structures have been harmful during the pandemic. Okay, so the opportunity zones. We're going to go through the intention, the geography, the benefits, recommendations, text. We got it all here. So the opportunity zone was a 6-page policy added into President Trump's American Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So this was done in 2017. I feel this was like one of his big policies, and the opportunity zone was subchapter Z. So it was really tucked in at the end. And the spirit of the incentive requires that investors must improve the lives of those living in the opportunity zone. What I find interesting about this is this use of the word spirit. Often when it comes to policy, we see the word intention a lot, like the intention of the policy. And I think something that we've all become familiar with in recent years is that impact is far more important than intention. And this has even kind of watered down even further intention to spirit. It's just kind of like the idea of the policy rather than what it's actually intended to do versus even what its impact will do. So the opportunity zones, now looking at geography across the US, are census tracts with median incomes of less than 80% of the area median income, or with poverty levels exceeding 20%. So for those of us that don't know what an area median income is, it's a common term that's used in housing. It's abbreviated to AMI, and it's kind of the most middle income. If you laid out all of the incomes of an area from lowest to highest, it would be the one right in the middle. And the area median income is determined by the Department of Housing and Urban Development federally. So just to give you a little bit of a frame of reference. So Within Pittsburgh, these are our opportunity zones outlined in red. We have west, north, east, central, and south. These are designated by the URA, who kind of made like a fact sheet to attract investors to come invest in opportunity zones. So we can see a lot of really familiar geographies here. We have like the Hill District in Uptown. We have Perry Hilltop on the north side. Homewood and Hazelwood, areas that were, I think, in Pittsburgh are very familiar as being historically disinvested neighborhoods, historically Black neighborhoods. And obviously that's all very relevant throughout the context of the opportunity zone. So I'm going to quickly go through this, but this is kind of where I spent majority of my time and labor with the opportunity zone thesis, was understanding how this tax policy worked, which was, it's extremely complicated. So I've tried to kind of distill it, but also we have to understand that there's a ton of nuance here. So this is not necessarily comprehensive, but it's a good introduction. So to invest in an opportunity zone, you need to use a capital gain, and you get a capital gain by selling an asset. So this could be a stock, it could be property, it could be belongings, something that you bought for $100 and sold for $1,000, and that difference of $900, that's your capital gain, and that capital gain then gets taxed in our outside of the opportunity zones. But what happens with this opportunity zone tax policy is that you can take that $900 that would have been taxed and invest it into an opportunity zone, which are these areas designated by, like I just showed, which are designated by the policy and are chosen by state governors. And if they invest that money into an opportunity zone, they don't have to pay taxes on it for up to 7 years. If they keep the money in that area for 7 years. After 10 years from the original investment, there are no capital gains taxes on the opportunity zone property. So if they were to sell that property in Homewood or in Wilkinsburg, they wouldn't have to pay taxes on it. They wouldn't have to pay capital gains taxes on it. There are other forms of taxes. One thing that's really important to note here is that only 7% of the American population is eligible for capital gains taxes. It has to be kind of a certain volume of money. You have to have a certain level of income to even qualify to be taxed for a capital gain, which means that only 7% of Americans of the American population can invest in opportunity zones. And that's a very specific population too, very, very wealthy. And then just to give you a little bit of an idea of the timeline, there's some stuff on here that I'm not going to talk about, which I'm happy to clarify, but I'm also going to share at the end of the presentation. I'll share a link to a Google Drive folder, which has my whole paper, which I wrote on this, as well as some other things. So if you want to get more into the weeds of how the policy actually works. So like I said, the policy was created in December of 2017. And 2018 was the first year that people could invest in the opportunity zones. So one thing that's really interesting here on this timeline is you hit 2026 on the far right. No new opportunity zone investments are going to be allowed after 2026. So we have this window up until 2026 to invest in it. In addition, 2 years later, in 2028, the opportunity zones expire. So there'll be no more tax benefits for investing in an opportunity zone. So this kind of window of time, this window will just kind of close, and whatever people have invested in the area won't have the same tax benefits that it does currently. So in theory, if the opportunity zones go on to be extremely successful, at that 10-year mark, there could just be mass buying and selling of properties within opportunity zones, which could be extremely harmful. So after the opportunity zone was written, like I said, it was 6 pages. That's really short for a tax policy. People were extremely confused. How does this work? Where does it apply? What are the limitations? So follow-up tax policy of, I think around 500 pages was written to give limitations and requirements for people who invest in opportunity zones. So the requirements and limitations include preserving the existing community, improving the built environment, expanding education and job opportunities, and substantial improvement. Now, the first 3 are pretty vague. They don't really say how you have to preserve the existing community or how you have to improve, expand education and job opportunities. They just say, do those things. However, substantial improvement is a real explicit monetary value, which of course I'm blanking on at the moment, but like I said, it's all in my report that I have in the Google Drive. So while there is a very explicit amount of monetary investment that has to go into these communities, these are these really vague spirits or intentions behind the policy, which is to preserve the existing community. And this also kind of falls on the concept of developers, or what concepts the developers or investors have when it comes to expanding job opportunities. Expanding job opportunities could be opening an Amazon warehouse, or which, time and time again has been like knocked down in the Pittsburgh area. Improving the built environment, that doesn't mean like stormwater management necessarily, or sidewalk repairs. Could just mean like building luxury condos or private pool. I'm picking random stuff here. These are not actual examples. So these are really to the discretion of the investors and the developers, not the community that exists in the areas. So as kind of further back context for the opportunity zone, it was originally drafted by Cory Booker, who's in this little collages on the left, and Tim Scott, who's on the right. And this is a bipartisan bill. Cory Booker is a Democrat, Tim Scott is a Republican. So they kind of drafted this a couple of years before it showed up in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And they were really disappointed by the original text. They thought it didn't have enough reporting requirements and penalties. There's very little by means of reporting requirements and penalties. There are certain self-certification forms that people have to fill out, but it's, like I said, it's self-certification. So there's very little oversight into how these opportunity zones are invested in and run. On the other hand, we have Representative Rashida Tlaib, who's on the right, and Representative Pramila Jayapal, who's on the left, and they've called for a full repeal. So what's interesting about these 2 representatives is that they represent very different parts of America. Rashida Tlaib represents large parts of Detroit, whereas Pramila Jayapal represents large parts of Seattle. And we have in that what we can kind of understand from our general knowledge of the recent history of the US, extremely different context. Detroit is a city that went into bankruptcy, that fell after the fall of the auto industry in the US. That is extreme poverty. Whereas Seattle is extremely wealthy and has some of the biggest companies in the US, including Microsoft, Amazon, Starbucks. And what's interesting, looking at that dichotomy, is that large parts of each downtown are qualified opportunity zones. So the way that they were able to choose geographies was very clever. They said the intention was it had to be impoverished areas or areas that had low area median incomes. But to be able to include parts of downtown Seattle doesn't really seem like there's an intention to help disinvested communities, but rather to look for tax havens where they could also reap huge benefits in terms of development profit. Whereas in places like Detroit, you might end up seeing large amounts of gentrification and further displacement of existing communities. So that was the background of the opportunity zone. I'm happy to answer questions about it at the end. I'm realizing that, as comments come up in the chat, I'm having a hard time fielding them. I guess I'm a single-minded person. So I'm happy to answer questions at the end as well. And I'm really excited to discuss with everyone. But now we're going to look at historic context, which include redlining, urban renewal, housing choice vouchers, and inclusionary housing. So this is not comprehensive. These are just some examples that I looked into during my research. And as I mentioned earlier, some of us may be more familiar with than others. So just to start looking at kind of the policies that we will look at, housing policy, while often good intentioned, has perpetuated oppression and created social structures which enable the capitalist exploitation of the urban poor and BIPOC Americans. So all of these housing policies that I'm going to go through, I will kind of present as not just the outcomes and the realities of these, but the intentions, the original intentions that went into these policies and what we see today as just blatantly racist or classist policies. So starting with redlining, which is probably the most notorious, infamous, and has had huge impacts on housing in urban areas across the United States, everywhere and in perpetuity. It was the practice of mapping neighborhoods to determine how loan officers, appraisers, and real estate professionals evaluated mortgage lending risk. So this is a map of Pittsburgh, as we can recognize, and these grade A through grade D. So grade A is the best, and grade D is quote unquote the worst. Now, if we kind of look at this as like how we kind of understand Pittsburgh, or kind of what are some of the general understandings, you can see parts of like most of Squirrel Hill is rated very highly, whereas areas like the Hill District and East Liberty and Homewood see much lower grades. And this is obviously explicitly because of race. So this is an area description that I pulled from a part of Homewood, which has favorable influences and detrimental influences. So the favorable influences is that it's near the East Liberty Business District. This was in the 1930s, just for context. The detrimental influences is that there's a concentration of foreign and Black populations. I think that not much has changed. If we think about how Homewood sits today, it's still a very largely Black neighborhood and still is adjacent to and feeling the pressures of employment in East Liberty. So I said that I would also go over kind of what the quote unquote good intentions were for this policy. Redlining was created in response to the New Deal trying to make it easier for people to buy homes. After the Depression, people didn't have money. The country was trying to get back on its feet. And Truman said, we need people to buy homes. And to do that, we need to give more favorable loans. We need to give more generous terms. And we need to get people to buy houses. But to do that, we had to make sure that those loans were safe investments. And to determine whether or not they were safe investments, they did redlining to say, this is a good place to invest. This is a poor place to invest. Now, obviously, the very explicit racism just destroys any sort of equity that we might see in a housing policy like this. But when you go back and you look at the original intention, which was to show safe places to invest, to encourage more home ownership in America, it doesn't sound too different to something that we might create today. So next we have the Fair Housing Act of 1949. So this map that we have on the right shows the tan areas. The tan solid areas are areas that were graded C or D during redlining, and the Black areas are some of the large identifiable urban renewal projects that we saw happen in Pittsburgh in the 1940s, in the 1950s. So the goal of the Fair Housing Act was to eliminate slums and blighted areas and provide a decent home for every American family. So if we look at our urban renewal projects, they overlap pretty one-to-one with the exception of the downtown area, the Point. They overlap with the redlining areas. And so this was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They told lenders 20 years ago, these are bad places to invest. You shouldn't lend any money here. Then because those areas couldn't get any investments, they fell into disrepair. Then in 1949, they decided that these areas need to be cleared because they're dangerous housing areas, areas for families to be living. But once again, those intentions, look at it, to provide a decent home for every American family. That sounds pretty good. And then we kind of see where affordable housing starts coming into the public consciousness in the US. Once a ton of displacement happened because of the construction of the Civic Arena in the Lower Hill District, there was no new housing built for these people. So there was a mass exodus of people from the Hill District looking for new homes, and they had nowhere to go. So part of the fair housing, part of that policy program was to create affordable housing for people to go after they've been displaced. However, they didn't want the public interest, private interest did not want the government to own the housing. They thought that would kind of like undermine the housing market, and that would just be terrible for private interest. So there was they encouraged private ownership of affordable housing and created these tax policies that said, if you maintain, we'll give you tax breaks every year if you maintain this affordable housing for 40 years. So there's a 40-year expiration. And those constructions happened between 1974 and 1983. So we are currently in that 40-year window. That 1983 to 2023, that's kind of the end of the window. And we've seen in Pittsburgh tons of demolition of this affordable housing over the past couple of years, which has just once again just restarted that cycle of clearing blight and displacing people due to the mismanagement of our national policy. And you could either call it a mismanagement, or you could say that somewhere deep-seated, this is intentional. This is an intentional cycle of displacement of poor urban populations and Black urban populations. So one thing that was learned through the urban renewal construction of affordable housing buildings is that they would both split populations and concentrate poverty. Now, whether or not this is kind of a mentality that we want to hold on to, there's this concept that concentrated poverty increases crime rates. So they figured, the best way to help this situation was to distribute poverty. You want to have mixed income neighborhoods, which do have marked benefits for the communities as a whole to have mixed income neighborhoods. So the concept of the housing choice voucher, which is still very widely used today, was to help very low income families, the elderly and the disabled to afford decent, safe, and sanitary housing in the private market. The same thing, a decent home for every American family. And so what I have on the map here on the right is those same layers as before, the grade C or D areas in Pittsburgh, overlaid with the urban renewal projects. And now we add housing choice vouchers. So where are the housing choice vouchers being used? While it is far more distributed than the urban renewal projects, you can still see huge amounts of concentrations in certain parts of the city. And so these dots are kind of clustered by census tract. These aren't the explicit locations where people live. This is more randomly scattered within census tracts. You see huge concentrations still looking at the East End in the Hill District, in East Liberty, and in Homewood. So this is not a very good method of distributing income across neighborhoods. So just clearing up the map a little bit and looking just at housing choice vouchers. There's no legal requirement for landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers. So there's a very clear ability to discriminate based on class, essentially. And obviously in the US, that is inextricable from race. So this is a form of racism in housing that landlords are not required to, or have no kind of encouragement to accept Section 8 vouchers. And essentially the way that they work is that a person who holds a Section 8 voucher pays 30% of their income in rent, and then the government covers the rest of the cost between that rent and the fair market value of whatever property that voucher holder is living in. The other thing that's really problematic about this is that we are just kind of like incentivizing landlords to continue exploiting poor populations, and in line with that, the government as well. The government is paying landlords to overcharge people for housing. And not to mention this 30% of your income going to rent value. That's what in the US we've decided is how much of your income should go to rent. This is at least 5% higher than most European countries. Most European countries say that 25% of your rent, some even say 20% of your rent should be going to housing. So we're still kind of taking more than we should away from poor populations in the US. So lastly, I'm going to talk about inclusionary housing, inclusionary zoning, which is a new concept to Pittsburgh, but is one that I am semi-familiar with from growing up and working in New York. Well, I won't say growing up, because I think the concept came around in New York around 2016. It requires or incentivizes private developers to designate a certain percentage of the units in a given project as below market rate, cheaper than their value on the market. So once again, this is privately owned affordable housing. So people who develop kind of projects that are more than 10 units or so are required to provide a certain amount of that housing as affordable. Developers would prefer not to. They're doing this work for profit. So they'll do everything they can to avoid cost losses. So that might, the way that we've seen it play out historically in urban renewal, and you can see it in the type of housing that accepts Section 8 vouchers, is a deterioration of the housing in which is required to be affordable. And in places like New York, I'm not as extensively familiar with inclusionary zoning in Pittsburgh because it's fairly new. In places like New York, there are rules to try and prevent the abuses of private developers on affordable housing, but people who are out for profit when it comes to housing are very, very clever. And there are always new things that have to be added in, because people who write zoning didn't think that someone could be that almost blatantly evil. There's this, I will say, as an aside, there's this concept of the poor door. So when housing in the past in New York was required to build a section of the building as affordable, they would have a separate entrance for people who were in the affordable units. So the people who would enter into the market rate units in the building would have these like grand entrances, and the people who were entering into the affordable units would enter into this side door with very little, it was utilitarian. You can't help but kind of see the parallels between that and segregation pre-civil rights in the US, and the way that people still do this just for profit. So now back to inclusionary zoning. Apologies for that aside. It currently exists in Lawrenceville, and it's moving its way through being established in Bloomfield and in Polish Hill. So this is, it's not a bad thing to build affordable housing. And I'm looking forward to the opportunities that this might bring. It's already built good affordable housing in Lawrenceville. It's always good to be conscientious of ways in which people will abuse these policies, and that we're still kind of giving landlords and developers outs to continue exploiting poorer populations. So throughout that, I'm saying that we're going into critique now, but I think that if you look at the patterns throughout those policies, I've been giving a pretty heavy critique. But we're just going to kind of go into, the specifics of that at least. So these screenshots that I have here are 3 of the 6 pages of the Opportunity Zone tax policy, which I analyzed for this presentation. Now, this is not unique to the Opportunity Zone tax policy and is in fact the norm. And these 6 pages were extremely simple. Where is inclusionary zoning in Allegheny County besides Lawrenceville? Right now, it's just in Lawrenceville, and it's being proposed next door for Bloomfield and Polish Hill as well. So that just needs to go through the city council to be established in Bloomfield and Polish Hill. I will say as well that it's still kind of an iterative process for Pittsburgh, because they're still trying to figure out how it's going to work here. So there are established rules, but I see them becoming kind of more fleshed out, more established in the future. In places like New York, for example, where inclusionary zoning exists, the one kind of big improvement that they have made is that the affordable housing that is built under the inclusionary housing policies have to be affordable in perpetuity. So there is no 35-year expiration date, which is a huge change based on some of the policies that I've gone through here. I don't know whether or not that's true in Pittsburgh, but it's definitely an opportunity. Thank you, Chris, for your question. So the legislative text for the Opportunity Zone policy is simple compared to a lot of other legislative text. This is a huge barrier for people that want to utilize affordable housing benefits. This is accessible only to people who study legislative text. This is not something that I was really even able to understand. It took me a week to read just 6 pages, and I'm a highly educated master's degree student, and this wasn't written for me. It's explicitly written not for me. And if it's not even written for me, it's certainly not written for Black and brown and poorer populations that need to access this affordable housing. So that's all to say that historic patterns are structured to benefit the rich while doing the bare minimum for the poor. We constantly blame the built environment for the failings of housing in the US, and we're not undoing our racist legacies, we're just ignoring them. So Ibram X. Kendi, I believe I have this quote later on, says that there's no such thing as a non-racist policy, there is only racist and anti-racist. So after redlining, which was explicitly racist, we did not attempt to undo any of that legacy, we just attempted to ignore it, to say this policy doesn't register race as a factor, so it's fine, it's anti-racist that way. Privatization and commodification of housing is the national norm, but there's a need for a shift in our culture. We built our entire society, especially after the Depression, around using housing as an equity tool, buying a house and selling it later at a greater value. We don't buy food and then hoard it and then sell it again later at a higher value. We don't buy healthcare and then sell it later at a greater value. Some organizations do, but that's a good point to show the similarities between the housing market and the healthcare market, where housing is a human right. We need housing to survive. And until we kind of separate out the commodification of housing and the need of it, we will always have housing will always be a crisis in the US. And as long as affordable housing is privately owned, quality of life comes after profit. That's just a fact. There is no market rate developer that wants to be building affordable housing. And so one of the biggest suggestions I'm going to be going into is communally and publicly owned housing as a necessity. Affordability expiration dates threaten the security of housing. So this is something I've touched on already, but that cycle of just recycling people in and out of housing that is allowed to deteriorate for decades, and then almost blaming it on them for the disinvestment and the expiration of affordable housing. The need for affordable housing will never expire. Every single one of us needs access to affordable housing, whether or not our income is $12,000 a year or $100,000 a year. So I'm going to go through kind of like how this applies specifically in an area of Pittsburgh. I'll focus on Homewood because it has so many of the different policy impacts in that area. So again, here's our map of all of our different policies that I looked at. The dark red line is the opportunity zone areas. The tan background is areas graded C or D in redlining. The gray areas are urban renewal projects, and the red dots are housing choice vouchers in the city. So looking at Homewood, this is the census tracts that make up Homewood and is also the opportunity zone outline for the neighborhood of Homewood. It's a historically disinvested Black and working class neighborhood and is designated as an opportunity zone. It was largely graded C or D under redlining. And while this doesn't have an urban renewal project in it, many people who were displaced by urban renewal projects moved to Homewood. There's a high concentration of housing choice vouchers. And so you can kind of see many of the overlaps of the housing policies that we've had in the US and how they've negatively affected Homewood, even though they were written and created with positive intentions or spirits. So along with historic patterns of oppression, the neighborhood is currently feeling economic pressure from wealthy adjacent neighborhoods. So this drawing was adapted from a study done by the URA, which is highlighting the busway stop in Homewood and how Homewood is feeling pressure from East Liberty and Bakery Square, spillover from Oakland and spillover from Regent Square. And as Pittsburgh becomes a more popular city, I mean, I stayed here, I came here from New York and I stayed here. This is gonna be a threat to the community in Homewood. However, Homewood's recent neighborhood plan is an incredibly comprehensive, incredibly complex. It covers all walks of life and it includes so many community members. This is the type of work we need to be seeing and doing. Mr. Queeb, you helped write this. This document I've come back to again and again and again because it is a perfect example of how we should be not writing policy, because these are more suggestions, but how policy needs to be using this work rather than looking directly to developers or historic precedent for policy writing. So in this little section here, I overlapped the 4 goals of the Homewood Comprehensive Community Plan with the 3 spirits of the Opportunity Zone. So the 4 categories of goal for Homewood is community, development, mobility, and infrastructure. And then the three spirits of the Opportunity Zone are improve the built environment, expand education and job opportunities, and preserve the existing community. So I'll just go through these 3 and talk about whether or not the Opportunity Zone will actually help achieve these goals. So the first one is improve the spirit of the Opportunity Zone is to improve the built environment. So I think this one is probably the one that will actually be in some definition achieved by the Opportunity Zone, because it requires an explicit capital investment to be made into a property. So while we can see that as a positive, like they're actually going to be putting money into a neighborhood, some of the goals from the Homewood neighborhood plan are improve the air quality, improve networks of sidewalks, stormwater management, community-led development, and Homewood-specific design and standards. People who are investing their capital gains are looking to avoid taxes for a while. They are looking to increase their profit. And to, increase your profit in an urban setting when it comes to development is to develop high-end housing. Improving the air quality is not going to make them money. Improving networks of sidewalks is not going to make them money. Maybe improving the sidewalks in front of their property. Stormwater management, if they have the foresight to think, that these areas are going to flood in the future, maybe, but that requires an amount of foresight that maybe a 10-year opportunity zone, they don't necessarily care about. There are no requirements for community-led development or neighborhood-specific standards. So you might see new development that will kind of, by some definition, improve the built environment, but it will kind of improve the built environment in pockets, not in a network of communities. Next is expand education and job opportunities. Again, this is the spirit of the opportunity zone. The businesses that are brought into neighborhoods by opportunity zones are not required to employ community members, and there are no incentives to invest in education programs. So these, like I said, these businesses could be a new Google office or an artisanal, I'm trying to think of like something really hipster, artisanal pillow store. Sorry, I got myself off track by thinking about that. And so as compared to the Homewood neighborhood plan, they want career readiness and placement. They want access to quality transit. They want access to open spaces. They want safe routes to school. And also, they don't just want these things, they need these things. And access to open spaces and safe routes to school, like I said, are not going to make money. I think there's very little incentive for opportunity zone investors to expand specifically education opportunities. Job opportunities possibly, because businesses will ideally turn a profit, but encouraging education for local communities probably won't help them make any money off of this investment. Last is preserve the existing community. This is a spirit of the opportunity zone. And one thing that's really important, especially for this example, is that who's defining what preservation of the existing community means. Barb, there will be, this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. And I mentioned this very early on, I will also provide a link to my report, this presentation itself, as well as some other resources that I put together for my work on the thesis as a whole. So there'll be more comprehensive stuff there as well. So for preserving the existing community, who's defining that? What does it mean to preserve the existing community to a developer or someone who's invested in an area? And I think one note on this is that reliance on goodwill developers has brought us to where we are now. If we rely on those who if we rely on individuals or organizations to carry out the spirits or the intentions of a policy, that ends up being just as harmful as a blatantly racist policy like redlining. And so the Homewood Development Community Plan wants to expand and highlight African-American heritage and culture. They want to prevent displacement, they want healthy food access, and they want pathways to ownership. I think this one most explicitly, pathways to ownership, are not going to happen under the opportunity zone unless in 10 years, someone that sells their opportunity zone property sells it to a local community member, which again and again, like I said, will probably not turn the profit that they want. So coming back to this Ibram X. Kendi quote, there's no such thing as a non-racist idea, only racist and anti-racist ideas. So the policies that we've seen following redlining, and of course there were racist policies before that as well, these are just ones that I focused on today. Lost my train of thought. We didn't do anything to undo the racist legacy of redlining. We just kind of followed up with non-race specific policies, which are just as harmful as recreating, well, they are effectively recreating the racist policies of the past. So I'm quickly going to go through some recommendations for the opportunity zone, and after that go into some alternatives, which is like the really fun section. So first, the one thing that we could do to improve the opportunity zones is expansion of investable assets within the opportunity zone. So very early on, I mentioned that only 7% of the US population qualify for capital gains taxes, which means that no one in Pittsburgh can probably afford to invest in an opportunity zone. Very few people in Pittsburgh would be able to invest in an opportunity zone, especially if 7%, the 7% of Americans that are the highest wealth are not going to be living in areas that have 80% or below area median income. So these investments are explicitly coming from outsiders to a community, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't incentivize, encourage, or require local coordination or communication or partnership. So one opportunity would be to allow local investments to also be made with different tax benefits or incentives, so that it's not just you're investing your capital gains into the opportunity zone. You can invest whatever, if you have some savings, you can invest that into a community that you know and love. And then with that, you get a tax break. That sounds pretty good to me. And then eventually you do get a return. Not only are you just donating money and getting a tax break, you can possibly get a return on that in the future. It might not be substantial compared to the capital gains returns, but this would encourage kind of local communication, cooperation and collaboration on investing in property. Another option would be to reserve a percentage of housing as affordable within the opportunity zones. This would follow the trends of many of our other housing policies before us, inclusionary housing, even some, the Section 8, I didn't refer to it as Section 8, the urban renewal. You reserve part of the property as affordables, and then it's privately owned and managed affordable housing, which is problematic, but is better than no affordable housing. And would also be difficult because the opportunity zone expires in 2028. So what happens then? Does that property, how do you sustain that affordability? So this would be a very short-term fix, but would be better than nothing. Alternatively, going back to Rashida Tlaib and Pramila Jayapal, is to repeal the opportunity zone. Many people see the inherent flaw of the policy, and you cannot fix something that at its core is broken. Rashida Tlaib has flat out said that the American people have been scammed by the opportunity zone. So this is, they're not being nuanced about this. So when we repeal the opportunity zone and everyone has to pay their capital gains taxes, what are we looking at in terms of alternatives? So one alternative is to build more limited equity property. This starts to tackle that American concept that housing is a tool to build equity. You buy a house in a limited equity property, you buy a house that is affordable to you. And then when you sell it, you can make some money back, but not a ton, so that then it can be sold again for affordable amounts of money. And we can use federal loans to incentivize this. However, currently federal loans don't have loans specifically for this kind of housing model or any forms of alternative housing model. So it is really difficult to build alternative forms of housing model. If I told the FHA that I wanted to build a community-owned housing project and would like $1 million, they would say no. If I said I would like to build a private property for me and my 2 cats, can I have $1 million? They'd say probably. So we need to be federally incentivizing alternative housing policies. An example of this, which actually did get built through federal loans, is Belmar Gardens, which is here in Pittsburgh. It was developed out of a need for middle-income African Americans to own their own homes, specifically in a time when they couldn't build homes. This was kind of right around the beginning of urban renewal, and they still weren't able to buy or build their own homes. Yes, Mr. Queeb, the Belmar is a housing co-op. So it's owned and operated by the shareholders of Belmar Gardens, and the shareholders of Belmar Gardens are those who live there today. So it was cooperatively bought and built using an FHA loan, and it's a limited equity property. So you can't sell your property for exorbitant amounts of money. You have to sell it for an affordable amount of money, as established by the board of Belmar Gardens. And it was built using an FHA loan, but it's important to note that they had a wealthy white partner who was able to help them secure the loan, because independently they would not have been able to secure an FHA loan. Another example of housing co-ops that are established by local policy is the Mitchell-Lama development projects buildings in New York City, which are aging out. A lot of people are collectively agreeing to take it out of the Mitchell-Lama program, which means that they can sell their properties for much higher amounts of money. But historically, it was a program that would provide affordable rental and cooperative housing to moderate and middle income families. So, and no new Mitchell-Lama buildings are being built. So at a time, I think there were around 500,000 Mitchell-Lama apartments. And now I think they're less than half of that. So this is a program that has been being phased out, also because it wasn't continued to be built, and also because we weren't able to deconstruct this concept that housing is a way to turn a major profit independently, or, you know, for an organization. Next is the concept of a community land trust, which is very similar to a co-op, but is a little different in the way that it's managed. There's a community land trust in Pittsburgh called the City of Bridges, and they develop permanently affordable housing assets in changing communities to stabilize and preserve character of neighborhoods and prevent the displacement of limited income families. So I won't go through this whole diagram, but this was the diagram that I read over and over and over again to try and understand how community land trusts work. But essentially, the organization that runs the community land trust owns the land that your house is on, and you own the house. And then you discuss with them when you want to sell how much to sell it for. And then this also kind of helps collectivize management of properties as well. So if you independently don't know what to do when your storm sewer backs up, that's not an independent problem. You have a community which has funds to help you with those problems. And the interesting thing about the City of Bridges CLT is that it's not just one location. It's not an acre of properties. It's scattered across the city. So it's not one place specifically located, which I find really interesting as a concept, because most of the times community land trusts, housing co-ops, things like that are in one location. So alternatively to co-ops and community-owned properties, we need to expand public housing, publicly owned, government-owned housing for more diverse income ranges and communities. Public housing in the US does not have a good rap. It's often seen as places of concentrated poverty, of crime, of blight. But I would just like to reiterate that these are often because of the housing policies that we've established in this country, not because of the inherent negative aspects of publicly owned housing. For example, this is an image of the Harlem River houses in Manhattan in New York City. Intentions were good, but were thwarted by private interests once again. These were 4 to 5 story buildings, apartment buildings that with tree-lined streets. They had playgrounds and community centers. They were adorned with art done by Black New Yorkers. It was really, really lovely, and it was built in 1936, during segregation, because Black New Yorkers needed housing, and it was done by the, it was kind of completed by the mayor at that time. So it wasn't kind of, it was a, there wasn't a battle for, I'm sure there was a battle for, civil rights, but It was done kind of bipartisan, I guess. The problem is that white New Yorkers were really angry that Black New Yorkers got to have this nice housing in 1936. And so there were many attempts to kind of deconstruct it. There were attempts to sell it. There were, you know, many attempts to kind of make it less than what it was. And it led to future public housing being built in New York that was subpar. The Harlem River houses now are a historic landmark. And I can't speak to the quality of housing there now, but it is still owned by NYCHA, which is the New York City Housing Authority. So it's still maintained as affordable housing in New York. Going abroad, looking at Vienna, after World War I, there was, of course, tremendous housing crisis in Austria, in Vienna. Much of the country was burned down. Vienna saw like terrible destruction. And so the government started building housing, and the government still owns 25% of the housing stock in Vienna, with another 25% privately owned, but rent controlled by the city government. Imagine 50% of our housing stock having controlled rent levels and being accessible based on your income level. That has huge impacts on the private housing market. They can't charge ridiculous amounts of money because otherwise no one's going to move in. So this extensive ownership of housing in Vienna makes sure that housing is accessible to everyone. And these public housing developments are highly sought after housing accommodations. They're not kind of subpar, second best. This example, Karl Marxhof on the outskirts of Vienna, is extremely popular and is also a historic landmark. So I actually got to visit it and go on a tour of the building. And I got to visit some other of the public housing structures in Vienna as well. And I want to move to Vienna and live in the public housing there. And what a magnificent thing that would be if we could have that in the US, where public housing that was accessible was also desirable. Something that is manageable, achievable in the short term before we actually deconstruct commodification of housing and build affordable housing is tenant unions. Solidarity is our strongest tool. There are tenant unions across the country, so many in New York, there are many in California and Washington as well. But it seems daunting to start, but has very easy first steps to organizing those who live in your building. An example that we can see of this in Pittsburgh is the Highview Gardens, which through the urban renewal was an affordable housing project that expired in 2018. So a developer could have come in and turned this all into market rate housing. Instead, PNC purchased it and extended affordability. However, it allowed the property to completely deteriorate. There was increased crime rates, there was leaks, there was gas leaks, water leaks, anything that you could imagine. And the residents formed a tenant council to meet with the owners and managers, as well as connect with Public Source, the news source, Public Source, who've been writing a series of stories on the Highview Gardens kind of situation through their Tenant Cities series, which has created so much traction for them to actually get the goods and services that they need in their homes from PNC, who have tried to blame miscommunication, have tried to blame the management company, who've tried to blame the pandemic, and enough is enough. And the tenants said so, and they're working to get their homes back to the way that they used to be. So I did a lot of talking this morning. And so I would thank you all for sitting here and listening to me this morning. I'm happy to kind of discuss questions or comments and kind of go over again anything that I went through, because I shoved a lot of information in this morning. So thank you, everybody.
And I think, Ryan, I was following along there. I think you answered every question in the chat, actually. So I went back through, there was a lot of statements. So I don't know if folks want to discuss some of those, but I think any direct questions you already addressed.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a discussion if anybody wants to talk about any of the items. Or, you know, it's Saturday morning. You can go have a cup of coffee.
Ryan, it's Rockweeb. You did awfully great. I was pleasantly surprised to see you mention the Homewood Comprehensive Plan. I did help work on it more so the food access part. And there's a dynamic activist in here, Miss Jenna Scott. And she was one of the leads in this because of the work she does in Homewood. She goes, she asked, how much community input have you had? She's asking a question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And then afterwards, Barb, I see your hand is raised. I had aspirations of going into and having real community input and building like an extensive community plan. But I was in the beginning stages of working on this thesis at the beginning of the pandemic. And then throughout the first couple of months of the pandemic, we were all told to kind of stay put. So I extremely unfortunately had virtually no community input for this. That's not to say that I want to keep working on this. I updated this for this presentation today, and I would love to kind of work on it in the future to expand community input on this project. So in no means is this work done. I would, like I said, I would love to expand it in the future because I didn't have the capacity to do that at the time. And I want to leave, well, Barb, go ahead, and then we can see if Zina has anything to add for me.
Yeah, hi, my name's Barb Warwick. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, I had it. So just a quick question is, we've talked a lot about housing here, but I'm also curious about, this is something that has been an issue in Hazelwood. I live in 4 Mile Run in Greenfield, right next to Hazelwood. So is that there are a number of projects to build housing, which is great, right? But in the community plan, there are also, there's also lots of demand for business spaces, right? Specifically a grocery store. Right now, like the community is actually working together to try and start a co-op grocery store. But to date, with all this development in Hazelwood, especially the Hazelwood Green right next door, these commercial spaces are, and I feel like the community is constantly told, oh, well, once we've grown big enough, you know what I mean? Like essentially, like once we've gentrified your neighborhood, then we can build a grocery store. And what are the ways to, because I mean, it is certainly frustrating, and there's all this money being poured into the development. It would be nice if some of that money could be put into simply providing, the neighborhood amenities, whether that be transit, grocery stores, whatever. At any rate,
Yeah, so the opportunity zone does give the opportunity for people to invest in businesses. However, so one thing I didn't mention is that like individuals don't invest directly into opportunity zones. They invest into opportunity funds, which are kind of, and then, it's like a middleman. And so a qualified opportunities fund, there's one, for example, run by PNC. And they've kind of decided that the best investment to make right now is in development. So that was kind of just like a decision made by PNC. They said, we're not going to go the business route. We're not going to really do that. So they've made that conscious decision to transfer it to something that will actually turn more of a profit. And one thing I do know from my urban design days is that grocery stores are not profitable. You need an extraordinarily, you need such a large population for a grocery store to turn a profit that people don't want to build them if they don't have to. This is not to say that grocery stores shouldn't be built. It's just to reiterate that all the development that happens for communities, unless it's led by the community, is done for profit, not to actually serve the needs of a community, which we can definitely see with the development of Hazelwood Green. So I will say that the Opportunity Zone has the opportunity for business investments, but many people are just opting not to do that because it's not going to be as profitable. So, it's kind of like a disappointing answer. Like I'm telling you they could, but they won't. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm happy to talk more about it. I'll kind of put all my contact info in there as well. So Zina, thank you for suggesting meeting with community groups by Zoom. I'll definitely reach out and see if they're kind of like interested in my input as well, because I wouldn't want to impose myself where I'm not welcome. And early on in the pandemic, I had no idea how to use Zoom and how to reach out to people through that method. I see that Emily put a question in, and then Ms. Requie, I'll come to you because I see your hand is raised. Work with graduate students who do various kinds of community engaged work. You share a memory of your school days at 6 with you. When your program training did well, it feels like ground level work, and then when the program training messed up, it caused harm reduction. Yeah, help versus harm. So my first semester at CMU, we worked with the Bloomfield Development Corporation on ideas for the IGA SureSave site on Liberty Avenue, for those of you familiar with Bloomfield. And that was a great experience because we went to meetings organized by the Bloomfield Development Corporation. And what it felt like was that we were doing work for them rather than us trying to pull information out of them. And it was like a fun process. We got to do kind of like engaging planning processes. And what we developed at the end of the semester was not necessarily, here's your plan for your neighborhood that we've imposed onto you, but rather here's a plan that we did just to give you ideas, the community ideas on how to come up with a plan for that area. And so I hope we had an impact on them, and that project is still moving forward with ideally with some inclusionary zoning housing policy. And then a time when my program caused harm or required a course correction. I mean, I can certainly think of times outside of my schooling where it caused harm or needed a course correction, but I think harm is also done when this is kind of not necessarily ironic for me to say, or hypocritical, is when a community is not engaged. In this project, I didn't necessarily say, here's my plan for the neighborhood of Homewood. So I didn't kind of impose something. But when something is more imposed, one thing I was discouraged from doing when I was starting my thesis project, I was like, oh, I kind of want to I was new to Pittsburgh. I was like, I kind of want to work on something in the Hill District because I knew it kind of had this historic legacy of a thriving Black community that was, decimated by different policies. And my thesis advisor said, no, they're so sick of students coming in, asking them vague questions, writing a report, and never showing up again. So I think it's important to be realistic and consistent. So that's also, when I was working on this thesis, I wanted to make sure I had something tangible and valuable before going to a community. And unfortunately, I just never had the opportunity to, not to say I won't in the future. Renee, I'm putting my email in the chat and so that you can contact me there. And Ms. Requie, you have a question or comment?
Yes, this is wonderful, Ryan. I think what Ms. Zina is trying to say, so what we did was started food access working groups, the first one in Homewood in 2018, and it's led by Bugs. But however, we have a meeting Monday, and on the agenda, Ms. Zina is leading the discussion about the Homewood comprehensive plan, and particularly food access. So I'm going to email you. Thanks, Max. Hi, Max. I'm going to email you. And, if you can't make it Monday, some other day, we meet once a month. I heard the lady mention how, about grocery stores. Yes, it is hard to start grocery stores. Hazelwood, Pieces, Sister Aisha, is a food apartheid area like Homewood, like the Hill District. So we created these different food access working groups to strengthen food access in these areas. And as far as Hazelwood, yeah, it's going to be a lot of work. We created a Black cooperative grocery store group, and members who are helping with the Hazelwood cooperative grocery store are in this group, led by Sister Sandra Cole and Pastor Love. And we were mindful that this is community led. And I hear what you're saying, what the lady said about how it can be taken over. But cooperatives are member and worker owned. That's the model that we're using. And, once the community meetings start and get more consistent, that's why we chose models for cooperative grocery store. Ms. Senna is actually on our advisory board for Homewood. And so it will be community input, design and led. But this was wonderful, Ryan, and I look forward to hearing more in the
Great,
future. Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to join listening in and learning and maybe being helpful for some work in the future. I'm not as familiar with food access. That's not to say I don't have kind of the skills or capacity to learn, but I'm happy to help, and I'm sure I'll get that information from you, Mrs. Requeve. Okay, I have some other questions. We have a question from Kari about this type of work or research in Central Ohio. I don't, however, email me and I will get you some information. I can especially get you some information on kind of like the mapping parts of this that I did, in looking at kind of that overlapping of redlining, urban renewal, other housing policies, which is a great place to start because you can start looking for patterns. So I put my email in there. And then Maura mentioned inclusionary zoning policies that have the potential to be worked around by developers. Are there things that community can do to be proactive in protecting the integrity of the policy? So the thing is that I'm not largely familiar with the inclusionary housing policies in Pittsburgh, also because they're kind of still in development. Like I mentioned, I did work in the past with the Bloomfield Development Corporation, and I know that they're very involved in that as well. So I think that, instead of trying to dive in independently and you read the policy, as I showed, that's like extremely difficult to do for someone who's trained at that level. Reach out to your neighborhood development corporations and see what work they're doing around it and how you can help out. I think that, there's the opportunity for Pittsburgh to learn from some of the mistakes that New York has made with inclusionary zoning, including things like the poor door. Two things that I'm interested in just off the top of my head is how long the affordable rental units will be affordable for. Is there a timeline, or is it in perpetuity? It also requires that some of the units be affordable for sale, which I think is far less common. Depending on if the developer is building rental or for sale units, some of the units will have to be available. Like I said, for sale affordable. But then tying into kind of this limited equity idea, is that kind of resident allowed to sell it then at market rate for Lawrenceville, or is there a requirement to maintain some sort of limited equity? Because as our mentality in the US is now, if I could go buy a house for 30% of my income over 30 years, or however they decide to kind of do that that money exchange, could then I turn around and sell it for 150% of my income to someone who wants to move into Lawrenceville? This is not to say that anyone has bad intentions, but that's the way that we've been taught to treat housing in the US. So that was a roundabout answer for me to say I don't really know, but reach out to your local development corporation. Most neighborhoods have one. Rodney?
Yes, hi. Thank you for your very very great presentation. I learned a lot. I'm still trying to absorb it all. One thing I can recall from another presenter we had earlier this year, his name was Rich Rothstein. He is the author of Color of Law, how housing units and segregation, federal segregation policies, helped create that, sort of environment of redlining and all those racist policies that brought us here today. And in it, he talked about how part of his motivation was learning about the No Child Left Behind Act, when Justice Roberts said that, essentially there was no de facto segregation, at the time, and that was part of his ruling. And so, he took that and wrote in his book more about, how police enforced segregation at the time, and sometimes helped drive out Black homeowners. And so I think that, it's great to sort of see how these things can be sort of turned against them these days with, the land trusts and using them and learning how we can mobilize our resources to sort of make these corrections. And while we, point this out to our lawmakers is just it is what we need to do. So thank you again for your great presentation, and I'm looking forward to watching the recording so I can see what I missed.
Yeah, thank you, Rodney. Yeah, it was a ton of information. And before I leave, I'm gonna pull up my Gmail. I'll stop sharing my screen. I'm gonna pull up my not my Gmail, the Drive account that I put some of my work on. So this also has kind of my whole report that I wrote on the topic, which is simultaneously more extensive on some topics, but also doesn't include some of the other things I discussed today, because I didn't update the report for today, so I don't have things like talking about a couple of the alternative housing policies, and some of the updates on inclusionary zoning. But it's a ton of great information there as well. And the Color of Law is a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to learn more about some of these housing policies. There's a ton of overlap between my presentation and the book that is much more extensively done and much, it's a fantastic book. The benefit here is that I was able to talk specifically about Pittsburgh, but yeah, I would recommend that book to anyone who wants to know more than what I discussed today. All right, I shared the link. I'll make sure it's public in a couple of minutes, so I don't have to try and figure that out right now. Does anybody have any other comments or questions? Thank you so much, Rodney, for the nice compliment. I'm really happy that you were able to enjoy it. And I'm also really excited for the opportunities that have met me here, with the opportunity to work with Mrs. Requebe and Zina, and some others of you in the future as well. I'm super excited about that. So thank you, everyone. I'll stay on for a couple of minutes. Mrs. Requebe and Rob, who I believe is still on here somewhere, were assisting me today with letting people in. So thank you to them as well, and kind of fielding comments and questions. So the three of us will be here if anybody wants to, ask more one-on-one questions. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone. And this session was recorded, so it'll be made, it'll be put onto the YouTube page, which I'm not as familiar with, but the recording will be available.